Why bother getting a degree in 17th century literature, or analytic philosophy, or any of the decidedly non-applied arts that make up the humanities? Thinkers in the 19th century wondered the same thing, and it has been a challenge to those disciplines ever since. So what is the point, and can the humanities continue to make the grade? Joining us now for that, Paul Keene is a professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at Carleton University. It's nice to have you back, Paul.
Thank you.
So let's start with the basics. When we talk about the humanities, we mean what?
It's sort of an elastic term, and often it comes down to what departments are included or not in which faculty, but it's basically the disciplines that are interested in the study of arts and culture. So, English and French and history and so on. Sociology, some people would count some, most of us today count it and so on. Political, then you get into the social sciences, and it's kind of a gray zone where the humanities end and where the social sciences begin. There's nothing written in stone, so it's better to kind of go with the kind of elasticity of it and accept it as a bit of a baggy category.
So I've read that's something to do with thinking, the study of thinking, human thinking or something like that?
Yeah, I guess that's part of it. Although, people in math or so on would tell me that that's what we do too, and so on. One of the things I really think is important is to get out of those kind of either ors, and I'm not attributing it to you at all, but to that we as a society not think in terms of the either or. So you have culture versus the scientists, the humanities versus the sciences, those two cultures, or versus the social sciences.
Because all those disciplines are helping us advance.
Yeah, and they all are more interesting and more valuable when we think about their connections to each other. And I think it really is a distortion when we start spending too much time thinking about how one is distinct from the others.
So how did the humanities emerge?
Well, emerges. So if the humanities in some ways are the institutional side of arts and culture, where we think, and it's not exclusively in the institution, but it's where we think critically and wrestle with ideas about the kinds of activity and artistic expression and thinking and debates that we see in culture and the arts. It emerges in the early 19th century. And what most people don't realize, and there's a critic named Raymond Williams who was fantastic on this stuff, and Williams has an interesting point. He said that culture, the word itself as we know it, doesn't exist before the early 19th century. They didn't, they might have had this idea of like the Republic of Letters or the liberal arts and so on, but they didn't have this idea of culture as a kind of a knowable area of activities. And that emerges in the 19th century, in the early 19th century, and partly as a way of pushing back against what they saw as the excesses and so on of the Industrial Revolution. So the culture was seen as the place that could humanize us and give us some kind of critical leverage in some of those debates. And the humanities emerges roughly around the same time in a lot of the arts and sciences institutions that come out, in the plans for the new University of London, which emerges in the 1820s and so on.
And I'm wondering, to what extent do you feel pressured to make the case for the humanities today?
I wouldn't say pressured. I don't feel any negative, and I like the opportunity to make the case. What I feel pressured to do is try to resist some of the more negative arguments that we've been, I think, lured into making on behalf of the humanities because of that sense that we talked about yesterday of the crisis in the humanities that emerged in 2008 and so on, where there was talk of so many different kinds of crisis. And so that, I think suddenly you got, by having to make the case to senior administrators and so on about the value of the humanities and to make it to the broader public, whether it's Globe and Mail readers or whomever it is, right, TVO watchers, I think often by having to make the case again and again for the value of the humanities, we turn it into this very kind of rarefied domain, and we kind of slip back into some of those either-ors. The humanities mattered in ways that the sciences and so on. And I think what I would like to do is to redress some of those kind of oversimplifications, the either-ors.
I'm going to read you a quote from the Globe and Mail that you've mentioned. Human beings are a language species, but the place of literature, philosophy, and rhetoric in universities is under pressure from the mathematical sciences. As much or more than ever, we need people who can communicate well, who can think and argue critically. The liberal arts are necessary and good, but not sufficient in the modern age. So, are the liberal arts no longer enough?
Well, I clearly take issue with that comment, and it's nonsensical to me because it doesn't even talk about what it would mean to be sufficient. One interesting thing today is that not only are people getting jobs, more people than ever getting jobs in occupations that they didn't think they would. More and more people get jobs or working in places that in types of jobs that didn't even exist when they were going through school. And that's going to accelerate rather than decelerate. So what we need more than ever are the kinds of education that can give people skills that will make them adaptable in a whole range of ways. And actually, being good researchers, good thinkers, and good communicators are highly valued in both the public and private sector. So it's not, again, an either or. It's not that we don't need science and technology at all. That's not what I'm saying. And we do need those pathways and bridges, but I think what we also need is a much clearer sense of why the humanities and the kinds of thinking that the humanities can help to cultivate have an important role to play.
How far back can you trace this antipathy to the humanities?
Well, I find it certainly in the early 19th century in a very clear form, and then as soon as they say that, someone will say, yeah, but look at the 17th century, and then they'll say, yeah, that's nothing, look at the medieval period, Then you get someone who studies, Greece, ancient Greece, and say, but So my own research is late 18th and early 19th century Britain, and what's interesting is that you find it there in, I think, a much more explicit form with the utilitarian movement that emerges, and I can talk a little bit about that if you like.
Oh, yes. So you're working on a book on it.
Yep.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to do that. Dangerous question to ask an academic what their book's about.
But what is, explain to our viewers what utilitarianism is.
So what I was interested in, again, is how knowing more about the longer historical context can help us to have more interesting discussions today and to have more compelling arguments and to see things in a bigger picture, which doesn't back us into kind of simplifications. And so what I became interested in as a follow-on to my earlier research about debates about literature in the period was the ways in which people who are making the case for the value of what we now call the humanities, whether it's people like William Hazlitt, people may know them names or not, but Percy Shelley, William Hazlitt, or John Stuart Mill, and a whole range of people, they were making the case for the value of the humanities in ways that are very familiar today, but in the face of real hostility from something called the utilitarians. And so those are primarily people associated with people like James Mill and Jeremy Bentham. And what's interesting, they were, what's interesting about them is that they were serious radical reformers, and they really wanted to tear up the whole British legal system and political system and rebuild it in far more egalitarian ways. Having said that, they're also deeply committed to absolute free market and so on, and to, in some ways, very disciplinary attitudes to the working class. So it was a strange mixture. But what's interesting is that they were absolutely committed to reform, but they felt it would be this kind of common sense ways of addressing issues. And it was about utility or the greatest happiness of the greatest number and so on. And a lot of them, people like Bentham and James Mill, had a real antipathy to the arts. They felt that they were not part of the arts as any part of this kind of movement for change. And so that, for people like Percy Shelley, who wants to say, you know what, the humanities or the arts or poetry has an important role to play in
he was pro-humanities.
Yeah, and so he's pro-humanities. Yeah. It's a lot easier to make the case for the humanities if what you can say is the people who oppose us are curmudgeonly reactionaries, so of course they don't like us. But if what you're saying, if the case you have to make is the people who oppose us are serious reformers and they don't like us, then you have to say why what we do matters in really important ways as well. That it's not simply self-indulgent or wide of the mark and something like that. And so what you get is a whole series of very interesting arguments right as they emerge in their modern form about why the humanities have a larger public value.
And what is that for you?
So there's two different answers, and one is running through all of them is that humanities allow us to better focus on the kinds of questions we're asking and to think more clearly about the assumptions we're making as we push for reforms that we think are inherently good. And now the two lines of response that come out, you have people like Percy Shelley and some things who want to say the utilitarian movement is short-sighted and doesn't think outside the box enough, and so sometimes it actually exacerbates the contradictions that it's trying to fix. And so the humanities matter more. And then you get a lot of more interesting thinkers like Leigh Hunt and John Struman. I wouldn't say more interesting, but they adopt, I think, a more interesting, nuanced position. You say it's not about either or, which is the thing I've been arguing a lot. It's actually understanding how these things have a kind of positive tension and productive relationship between them. And so, I can go on about that. But I think really what they're trying to do is say what we need to do is think in bigger ways about the debates that we're having, and the humanities can help us to do that.
So what role did universities back then have in framing the debate about the usefulness of humanities?
I don't think the most interesting debates were going on in the universities at the time, partly because I think the universities were shaped by the debates rather than the other way around. Oxford and Cambridge really are still the humanities really is about the classics and teaching kind of Greek and Latin and so on, and the training that would qualify you as a gentleman and so on. So they are still a little ways away. And the University of London, which is being set up in the 1820s, and it's being driven a lot by the utilitarians because they really felt that knowledge could help to change the world and that education was crucial. If we could only get knowledge, expand the base of people who are getting a good education, then that would help to move society forward. And so they are happening in some of those cases, but they're driven more in many ways by the utilitarians. And so it was really happening more in public journals and so on, magazines and so on.
So what did the humanities contribute to society in the 19th century that the against side seemed to miss?
Well, I'll give you a great example what the against side seems to have missed. And again, it comes from Percy Shelley's defense of poetry, and it's a very kind of verbose, kind of high-fluting document, but this makes some very important arguments in it. He's stung because a friend of his, Thomas Love Peacock, in the Four Ages of Poetry, finishes it with this real diatribe against poetry. He says anyone who becomes a poet is wasting their time and that of others. They should be gaining more useful knowledge, and all this mantra of useful knowledge and applied knowledge that we hear about so much today. And what Shelley says is that kind of utilitarian movement has a utility, but it's short term. And he says that the arts and so on actually have a bigger one. And he sounds like it's going off on that, the arts, how grand and stuff, which sounds pretentious. And actually what he does is he makes two references to what we now call the assembly line. Because this is the Industrial Revolution, it's the factory system. And he said, this new device for abridging and combining labor. So making each person do only one little thing, and then they pass it on to the next person, they do the one little thing. And Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations has what he sees as a glowing tribute to the assembly line in a pin factory, how each person does only one little thing 20,000 times a day. And isn't that great? And what Shelley says is, because we haven't actually thought about the bigger questions that poetry can help us with, he means poetry in a very broad sense for the imaginative thinking outside the box, what we've done is actually exacerbate the political contradictions that these things should have healed, that the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer. And it's because we didn't think about, we've got these unprecedented forms of productivity. How are we going to use them? How can they be used to make society better? And so the utilitarians were really good at pushing through pragmatic changes, but they weren't good at really stepping back and thinking, what are the unintended consequences? What are the bigger assumptions? How, in very revolutionary ways, possibly or not, can we harness this to really rethink society in a quite a visionary way? And so what Shelley says is, what poetry, or what we might think about the humanities does, is it enables us to imagine that which we know. It's a great way of thinking. Yeah, it allows us to imagine the kinds of things that we know and to think about, well, what is this knowledge? How is it going to help us? And how can it sometimes hurt us?
We touched on it a little bit yesterday, but are the arguments for and against the humanities the same today as they were 2 centuries ago?
Yeah, absolutely. And, they are a place where we have, at our best, the humanities can offer that space for imagining what we know all over again. I think, one of the things that really strikes me, and it's like the change is so huge and so fundamental, and we're so much in the middle of it that we haven't really realized how big it is. But the whole digital revolution is, we talk a lot about 500 years ago, there was the invention of the printing press, and that changed everything, and you had the Reformation and so on. And those changes were important, and that was huge. But a lot of historians say that took 1 or even 2 centuries to really filter out and have its full impact. And the actual material changes they introduced were not that radical. I mean, you had books before, but they were, hand done, and now you had books which were machine done. But the form, what we call the codex, the book form, was pretty much the same. Now you could just produce 10,000 copies of it fairly quickly, and then you need the infrastructure to disseminate it and so on. How, they didn't have cars or trains, so how did you get books? Which any college student knows how heavy a box of books are. How do you get those to Bristol or one of the provinces, and how do you find bookstores to sell them, and how do you get, how do you nurture that? So it took a long time for that to come through. Compare that to today. Within one generation, not 2 centuries, but a generation, everything has changed. And it hasn't just changed the speed or who gets to do it. It's changed how we think about reading, the relationships between readers and writers. It's changed about the kind of reading communities. It's no longer seen in kind of national traditions. It's international. Things go viral. And all of those kinds of things, they're highly political. If you think about the role that digital technologies have played in different places across the world. Arab Spring's a classic example, right? But we often, and these changes are so big and they continue to happen so fast that often I think we haven't really fully accommodated them in our understanding of what the implications are. And so the humanities, I think, are a place, and also the employment opportunities, and not just opportunities, but the problems, the kinds of jobs that are continually being rendered obsolete, that, at the lower end of, say, middle-class jobs or semi-skilled jobs, suddenly they're going to be gone because we can get robots who will do those jobs for us. Or, you go to the airport, you don't need to see someone because you can just scan your ticket in, and they'll be making us do that. And that's great, and it's dangerous in other ways if we can't figure out how to address that. It's going to be in everybody's best interest. And so we need places where people can step back and think about that bigger picture. And I think we still need to imagine what we know.
You've mentioned like 3 great ideas for a paper. I want to talk about now what's happening. And this is from Blaine Gretman, associate professor at the University of Iowa. And it was written in the New Republic about the crisis in the humanities. Rather than citing more statistics, we might ask why humanists keep simultaneously pursuing this field and lamenting its perpetual crisis. The answer is our crisis, which comes from the Greek word for choice, is that what humanities do best. All the hand-wringing might even indicate that our beloved tubercular heroine still has a little life left. What do you think about that, Paul?
So it's a great article. I know it. Well, it's well known in the academy. And the final reference, which is very kind of clever one to this tubercular heroine, it comes to his opening conceit, which is he says that he likens all of this talk about the crisis in humanities to the female protagonist in a 19th century novel who's perpetually dying of consumption and so on. So what he says in the article actually is that we do have this kind of ongoing inclination to talk in those terms. And he cites an article from the New Republic, same place that he's writing or publishing from 1970. So about a half century, getting on a half century ago, who says exactly the same thing. The humanities are going down the drain, and so on. And he says, in retrospect, how ironic that was an age of meteoric rise for the humanities, in numbers and interest and the energy of a lot of the debates and so on. And then he goes back to 1620s. So this is just after sort of Shakespeare, right around the time of Shakespeare. And Robert Burton, a writer from the period who says exactly the same thing. And now that so many people can read and write, everything's gone to hell. And he calls it this bastard age in which the muses have been banished. And so what this author wants to say is let's have a bit of context, that we tend to continue to do this cyclically. And often, ironically, the age of Shakespeare in the 1970s, it comes up at a time where, in retrospect, it seems least appropriate. And so why do we do it? And what he doesn't offer a lot of solutions. It's a fairly brief article, but what he's interested in is what's the attraction of talking in those ways. And in some ways, why we like talking about crisis is it's a way of making change make sense. That we can talk about this crisis, and often you get it when there's a radical change, whether it's more and more people reading, and suddenly it's spilled out beyond the academy in, say, the 18th century, and you get novel readers and a whole, a new expanded reading public, or more and more people writing, where publishing has changed, where it's become more bound up with the marketplace. Whatever it is, those kinds of changes are always more intelligible, not necessarily productively, but more intelligible if we can talk about it as a crisis. And I think that's his point there.
We've also heard of there being a war on science. Do the humanities and sciences share something in common then?
Fundamentally. And I know one of my colleagues is, his PhD, he's a mathematician, he does pure math, and he loves the fact that we have so much in common. He says, what I do is not applied knowledge. And often scientists will be quicker to make that case than the humanities, because they're more in danger, I think, of facing those kinds of pressures, of being hijacked to say, well, how can this be turned into some kind of applied thing? And what they want to do is curiosity-driven research, where they're thinking through ideas and pursuing them, and they're happy if those manifest themselves in actual social benefits in a range of ways. But that's not where they live. What they want to do, they're interested in ideas and experiments and thinking through kinds of problems. And so a lot of them, and this came up at a conference we held at Carleton this year, and we talked about yesterday, a lot of them will say, the humanities and the sciences are better when we recognize how much we have in common, rather than trying to build, to be played off against one another.
We've talked about the value of the humanities, but when it comes to solving real world problems like climate change, how do you use the humanities to solve that issue?
Well, clearly I don't want to, out of some kind of defensive posture, say the humanities can solve everything. And that's not helpful. And I don't think many people do that, but I think that a lot, as the example of Percy Shelley talking about the assembly line and saying, actually, it's one thing to have technological changes, but we need the kind of cultural changes.
More contribute?
Yeah.
How can humanities contribute to that?
Yeah, so the humanities can help us think through some of the bigger context of these things. And as someone recently put out a paper I heard, we're not going to science our way out of climate change. We need the scientific changes, but it also has to be a cultural shift. We need a sea change in the ways in which people are thinking about our relation to the climate, about the ways in which we relate to the world around us, and a sense of responsibility to the planet, and all of those larger questions that get down to who we are as a society, what our roles are as an individual, and how we relate to one another, and to both the past and to our future. And so those are cultural issues, and they're bound up with a lot of other issues that are geopolitical in very global ways, and we have to engage on all of those levels, and the humanities can really help us understand the cultural dimensions of those issues.
I want to play you a clip. This is novelist Ian McEwan in an interview discussing the humanities.
Many of the scientists I've met have read all the novels I've read, have been to the opera, know the partitas of Bach. They know our stuff, but we don't know their stuff. And I do feel a little flush of intellectual embarrassment about this. And maybe we need to be a little tougher. It's fine for me to say this now, I'm not going back to college, but maybe we need to be a little more demanding, and that all humanities degrees should contain a little embrace of the difficulty of just getting your mind around something relatively simple like the calculus, which actually is really quite tough, and it's an amazing invention. You think, a guy in a wig in the 18th century thought this up, of how you could describe the changing state of something. Amazing. But I don't think we ever have to confront anything very difficult.
What are your thoughts on what he just said?
Well, I think that, I don't know about his intellectual embarrassment or inadequacy, whatever. I think Ian McEwan likes, being provocative often, and so that he does it well. I have a few different responses. Actually, the interview, if you watch the whole interview, came out of his time at Caltech. He spent a little bit of time there, and a good friend's a professor at Caltech, who's actually the dean of undergraduate students there. And I think, first of all, it's a pretty rosy vision of scientists, that they've all read as many novels as we haven't gone to the opera. Many are interested in the arts, and I think that's great in a way that a lot of us are interested in the sciences. I don't think it is as overwhelming that they do everything that we do. And I also think that he seriously underestimates the challenge of doing humanities well. He says somewhere else in the interview, that not in the clip that you play, that, really, is it just about going to college and reading novels for 3 years? And if that kind of belletristic, vision of it was all it is, then I think he would be right. But actually what we try to do, and we do build in breadth requirements, and we say, even in first year, you can only take one course in your major area, because we want to push people out. We want them to do what he's saying, is to get interested in other areas. And there are programs, like at Carleton, there's a biology stream within our College of the Humanities, biology, humanities. So people on the humanities side are very interested in what's going on elsewhere in a range of ways. And to that extent, he's right. But the thing that I would really, I think, push back on with him is that, I think, kind of belletristic idea that all we do is go and read novels. And I think that might have been true in an age of kind of the great tradition, where really what you did was internalize what these great men thought. But really what we think more of the humanities now is a kind of ongoing argument between a whole range of thinkers and a whole range of cultural dynamics. And what we're training students to do is to wrestle with texts and to see them as part of larger cultural and political dynamics, and to really get to the point where they're comfortable handling complexity well. And as someone put it at a conference that I was at recently, the humanities are the one place where we work with incomplete data as our job description. That we know that what we do is irreducibly complex. You cannot get to the bottom of this is how society works. There's always going to be other perspectives. There's always going to be things we're leaving out. There's always going to be 50 years from now people saying, well, how come they could think that? How could they not have seen that? And we live in that moment where we are operating in an atmosphere of irreducible complexity. We can't ever feel like we know it all. And to force students to really take that on as the basis of what they're doing is really challenging. So actually to do it well is difficult, and I think that those skills are really challenging ones, and we should not be embarrassed about that.
Paul, thank you so much for being here. It's been an insightful 2 days.
Thanks for having me.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.